Okay, wonderful. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for joining this evening. It's good to see all of you, as always. And welcome. It's been actually a pleasure studying with all of you. I feel like we've, all of us have been together for nearly all of the classes. And so that's been incredibly satisfying to kind of study this entire kind of unit, as it were, of these three pillars together, and kind of to have that consistency with them, to kind of see the full complement of kind of how they all work together. Of course, this series, Judaism's Three Pillars, is being dedicated in the memory of my nephew, Donny Morris, Nachman Daniel ben Aryeh Tzvi, and it should be a blessing and a merit for him. And as we've mentioned in previous classes, this unit was I selected it as a way of honoring my nephew, because these really were each areas that he reflected so beautifully and really I would say represented. And it's a wonderful tribute to him to know that, you know, the three pillars of Judaism really were three areas that he excelled in to such an extent, and he really was a wonderful young Jewish man. That in some ways it makes his loss that much more difficult, but it also means that we know that he lived his life well, and certainly has left us something to learn in his memory, and hopefully to always be inspired by in the Jewish lives that we carry on as well. Each week I've added some additional photographs to this opening page. So I'll just point them out. So the one in the bottom middle is me and my nephew. That's me without a beard. When he was obviously a young boy. And obviously the part that you see on all these are his beautiful smile. He was a very sweet young boy and a sweet young man. And the picture in the top right I added as well. That's actually the last photograph we have of him. That was taken on his cell phone at Meron about 10 minutes before he passed. And again, you can just see the beautiful smile on his face, and what a wonderful time he was having. And so it's a wonderful way to remember him. He did always have this beautiful smile. And so this final pillar, the pillar of Gimilut Chasadim, the pillar of good deeds, we'll see was something that he carried on very well. And I think when we think of good deeds, we do think of this idea of kind of the interpersonal relations and kind of the way that we interact with the world around us. And so while when we spoke about the other of these three pillars, certainly we think about the study of Torah. Here we'll bring them up. When we think of the study of Torah, we mentioned that that's, you know, somewhat intellectual. And when we mention worship, that's something which is emotional, and acts of kindness, right? Those are the way that we interact with the world around us physically, the way that we relate to other people. And oftentimes the way that we relate to other people obviously first begins with our face, right? Begins with the smile that we greet people with, the warmth that we exude towards them. And as you can see from my nephew's face, that was just written all over his face, as it were. So this is a fitting way to tribute to him, to remember him, and perhaps to conclude this series on a note which is quite personal. And so, as we mentioned in the opening of this series, there are these three pillars that Shimon HaTzadik the last of the members of the Great Assembly, said were the pillars of Judaism, the three, shall we say, principles upon which the world stands. We've looked at it in terms of kind of the holistic approach within the Jewish tradition, right, between mind, body, and heart. Some look at this in terms of a bit more almost like communally as well. When you think about the idea of Torah, they interpret that as meaning law. And when you think of avodah, that's in terms of, shall we say, the cult or the worship, right? The religious component. And Gemilut Chasadim are, shall we say, you think of societies, you think of like the voluntary, organizations, and that you kind of need these three pillars for a healthy society, right? You need a society that's grounded on laws. You need a society where people have a sense of purpose, that's represented by the avodah, and you need a society where people, don't just rely on the laws, but also contribute and volunteer. And if you have those three things together, right, that's how you make a functioning society. And when a society loses one of those three things, it's often not something which is good. Rabbi Sachs, of blessed memory, talks about the lack of some of these components, the lack of religion in modern society, the lack of volunteerism within modern society, and kind of how you really need all of these components in order for the healthy functioning of a society. And while that's true kind of on a communal level, it's true on a personal, individual level as well, that for us to be kind of complete individuals, we need to have these different components as well. And in a Jewish context, we mentioned the idea of Torah in terms of the study of Torah, avodah in terms of Jewish prayer, and Gemilut Chasadim is the topic that I'd like to look at with you tonight. So let us begin by taking a look at one of the sources that we've already looked at in previous classes, but it's a wonderful source and worthwhile to continue to take a look at. And so this, we mentioned, was taken from the prayer book, and it says that these are precepts, the fruits of which man enjoys in this world, while the principal reward is preserved for him in the world to come. And they are honoring father and mother, performing deeds of kindness, early attendance in the house of study morning and evening, providing hospitality to guests, visiting the sick, participating in making the wedding, accompanying the dead, concentrating on the meaning of prayers, making peace between fellow men and between husband and wife, and the study of Torah is equal to them all. And while this selection, as we mentioned, reflects those three areas of Shimon HaTzadik, what I want to focus on now is the fact that most of these things, though all relate to just the final of those three pillars, right, that of Gemilut Chasadim, acts of kindness. And so while Torah is one thing and Avodah is one thing, Gemilut Chasadim is lots of different things. And I think that starts to kind of get to the point of the significance of Gemilut Chasadim, right, of how important it is that it actually manifests in so many different ways, right? Essentially manifests in all the ways that we interact and that we care for one another. So while there are specific mitzvot associated at their core, right, they're all are related to Gemilut Chasadim. Now, I was talking with Eddie on Shabbat, and he mentioned that in the Spanish and Portuguese prayer book, accompanying the dead is absent from this list. Is that right, Eddie? Yeah?
That's right. And also, I think providing for a bride as well is also not in the Spanish and Portuguese.
Right. So very good. So thank you for pointing that out. So and I'll just kind of repeat what I share with you on Shabbat, but for everyone's benefit, is that this text is essentially drawing on earlier texts. It says at the bottom over there from one Mishnah Pe'ah, and in the Talmud in Masechet Shabbat. And so this text is essentially somebody kind of compiled things together. And so it was compiled in, differently in different communities. The text as we know it today in our prayer book is not as ancient as the earlier texts, which might explain why there are some differences. But one thing I was thinking about, Eddie, in particular, in reference to the absence of accompanying the dead, is that if anybody are familiar with the Spanish and Portuguese societies, the society which is responsible for the burying of the dead has a particular name. Now, normally we refer to it as the Hebra, which means kind of the brotherhood. But does anybody know the complete name of the Hebra?
Lavadores. The Lavadores.
The Lavadoras is in terms of kind of the Portuguese, but it actually has a Hebrew name as well.
Oh, the Chevra. It's called Chevra. It's called Chevra.
So it actually, so I'll tell you. So the name that it's known by is the Hebra Gemilut Chasadim. That is the title by which it is it's officially known. And in fact, if any of you have ever attended a burial at one of the Spanish and Portuguese cemeteries, you may have noticed that at the end, the officiating rabbi or minister will recite the Hashkabah on behalf of the person that's passed away, and then will recite an additional Hashkabah, which is said on behalf of everyone that's been buried in the cemetery. And in there, it uses the language of the Hebra Gemilut Chasadim, that's been laid to rest on behalf of the burial society. And so it's interesting and perhaps not surprising, right, that this notion of chesed, right, acts of kindness, is perhaps most tightly identified with burial. And the reason for that is because it's considered to be a chesed shel emet, the greatest of kindnesses, because it's a kindness that one does without any expectation of a kindness in return, understandably. And so it's interesting. Perhaps I was thinking, Eddie, maybe the reason that they didn't need in the Spanish and Portuguese version to also say accompanying the dead is because Gemilut Chasadim itself perhaps already refers to that. But you have me stumped now with the weddings, so we'll keep that.
Actually,
Rabbi Morris, can I ask you, please, something? Because if I remember correctly, because I use the Ashkenazi Siddur Achshav, but I think they also have Ben Adam Lechavero Ben Adam Ishto, between man and wife. And I wonder if we have it in the Sephardi one, if that's so. I remember it from many, many years ago.
Yeah,
so
you can see it. You can see it here, making peace between man and husband.
Wife, yeah.
Yes. Absolutely.
So that's also very interesting.
Yeah.
Shalom.
Yes.
Coming back to this, the fact, of course, that by performing the mitzvah of the Lavadores, it's something for which obviously they cannot be thanked. But it reminds me of one of the jokes of one of the Marx brothers who said, "If you don't go to other people's funerals, they won't come to yours."
I'll just, as a point of clarification, Jonathan pointed out to me quite correctly. So the Lavadores is a society that's responsible for the washing of the bodies, the Tahara, and the Hebra Gemilut Chasadim is a society that's responsible for the cemeteries. So they're two different.
Yeah, because we call it the Lavadores. Yeah.
Okay, so let's continue on, because as I mentioned, it of course Gemilut Chasadim is all encompassing. You know, there's so many different manifestations of this idea of an act of kindness. And something that we need to think about, right, is this idea of the mitzvot in relation to these things, because of course, when you do these are mitzvot. Some of them are explicit mitzvot, some are just manifestations of the idea of kindness. We of course don't say a beracha. There's no blessing. When we do many ritual mitzvot, right, we say a specific blessing before we do them, before we do the shofar, shekel lulav, even for the study of Torah, but not when it comes to these. And the reason for this is not that these are lesser, but in fact, the fact that in a sense, these are at any moment, right? These are caused by a circumstance which calls upon somebody to act, to do something. And that's different than kind of a fixed commandment, right, of you shall sound the shofar. So we kind of approach it, we say, now I'm going to do it, and then we do it. When it comes to these other things, it's as the opportunity presents itself that you, in a sense, move into action. And with those, you don't say the bracha, you simply do the mitzvah, you simply jump into action and do the act of kindness. And it perhaps, that's perhaps a bit halachic. What that's reflecting is this idea that, certain things, have a point of time. Certain things, in a sense, we have to always be ready for them. When a moment arises, the point is we're called upon to simply get up and go and to act and to do. And it's an important lesson, right? That in a sense, we do not control the circumstances of when our acts of kindness will be appropriate, but we have to always be sensitive and at the right moment be ready to act that way. And of course, what that does, that speaks to the fact that has to be almost the way that we are. It has to be a constant in our, shall we say, our modus operandi, so that it's not a thing we have to prepare for and recite a blessing and kind of, like lead up to it. This is something which should just almost become innate within us, that we are doers of chesed, that we do acts of kindness. And it's something which is so important. And I'm going to show you how important it is, because one of the statements that it says at the end of this selection that we say in the prayer book is that the study of Torah is equal to them all. And we mentioned last week why that is, that Torah is considered so significant, perhaps because Torah leads to action. And sometimes people misinterpret it and say that, Torah is in of itself more important. But of course we know that if a person is in the middle of studying Torah and then an act of chesed presents itself, right, a person is supposed to act, right? You're supposed to go ahead and take care of what needs to be done. And that in fact, the essence of a person, right, should be as a doer of chesed, that at all moments we should be ready to do that. I'm going to show you an example from another text that we looked at last week. This is in the Talmud in Shabbat. And here Rava is discussing, what happens when a person passes from this world, and that when a person goes to heaven, that they are asked questions about how they conducted themselves in this world. And what we noted last week, though didn't have a chance to go into it, was that the first question that a person is asked is, did you conduct business faithfully? And only afterwards is one asked, did you designate times for Torah study? And so you have as the very first one is this idea about interpersonal relations, right? Is, were you fair in your business dealings, right? And so this starts to give you a little bit of a sense that before you can get to anything else is, in essence, did you live a good life, right? Were you a good person, as it were? Did you treat other people well? And what this source is speaking to is this idea that is the number one. That is the most important thing that a person should be doing. All these things are necessary. All these things are important. But in a sense, if we had to give hierarchy, right? One is, did you act appropriately towards other people? And so, as I mentioned, that if you're studying Torah and the act of chesed presents itself, if there's someone else who can do it, then you say, okay, let that person do it. But if there isn't, you interrupt your study of Torah to go do the act of chesed. And that just tells you, right, that in a sense, when a situation calls upon you to act, that takes the priority. That always has to be the first thing that a person does. And if that's not enough, I want to share with you one other source, and then we'll kind of take a step back, which also speaks to this idea in such a clear and I would say moving way. And so this next source that we're going to look at is a source from Rambam in his Mishneh Torah. And he's talking about, it's in his laws of the study of Torah, and he's discussing, you meeting someone who hasn't studied Torah, and you want to start introducing them the study of Torah. So you want to bring them to the Beit Midrash so that they can begin learning. And Rambam is wondering, do you just bring them immediately? Or is there something else that you have to look at first? And he says that you have to consider a few different things before you bring them to the Beit Midrash. And so look what he says over here. He says the following. He says, no instructions in the Torah should be given to any but a fit student of proper conduct, or to one indifferently known. But if one followed a way which is not good, we must first bring him back to goodness and lead him in the path of righteousness and scrutinize him, after which we may admit him to the Beit Midrash and give him instructions. And so here he says this amazing thing, that if you meet someone and they are not a good person, they do not treat other people well, you do not bring them to the Beit Midrash. You do not engage with them in the study of Torah. And we'll reflect a little bit later maybe on why that is, and from some other sources. But on a very basic level, what it seems to be saying is that it's simply just completely out of keeping with the Torah that someone who isn't a good person first would then be kind of going to the next level, which is engaging in higher study. Now, of course, with children, we teach them Torah, even if the kids are, being kids. But here it's talking about with adults, right? That we're dealing with adults. Someone's not a good person. There's, you don't just bring anyone to the Beit Midrash. There should be a level, a progression for how these things work. And it's interesting because I think this source goes against the way that a lot of people think, where they would say, no, you meet someone, bring them to the Beit Midrash, teach them Torah, and through the study of Torah, they will come to be a better person. And we say that on some level, right? That if you study Torah, you'll know what the rules are, and then hopefully it will lead you to then implement the rules and to live a moral life. But I think what it's speaking to is saying that actually you can't even begin to understand the Torah properly if you're not a good person. Because if you're not a good person, you study the Torah, you're going to find loopholes, right? You're going to perhaps misinterpret or take the Torah in the wrong way, and you'll actually ultimately make a mockery of what the Torah is trying to say. That actually, for a person to understand the Torah properly, you already have to, in a sense, have your head, on straight. You already have to kind of be in a good place. And then when you study the Torah, you can understand what it's saying, you can weigh things, you can evaluate things. But if you're not a good person and you study Torah, you're simply going to bring the aspect of you which is not good and in a sense sully the Torah itself. And the source reminded me of a beautiful story that I heard about my nephew at his funeral. His Rebbe, his rabbi in yeshiva was saying that, so he had gone to study in Israel for the year. And so at the beginning of the year, I guess among those who were studying in his shiur, in his class, so they had a designated rabbi. And so at the beginning of the year, the rabbi was kind of asking them, what should our goals be for the year? And of course it's yeshiva, so it's not simply like, okay, we came to study Talmud, we want to learn no, it was like more broadly, like, what do you hope to accomplish? How do you hope to grow during this year? So the kids were making different suggestions. So, one kid said, we need to, grow in our knowledge of Torah. Another kid says, we have to become more fervent in our prayer, and somebody else says, we have to, delve more deeply into our religiosity. They all had kind of those types of ideas. And so the rabbi was like, okay, fine, those are all wonderful, and was kind of ready to wrap up the class. And then he said at the funeral that my nephew, was raising his hand, and he says, yes, Donny, what is it? And he goes, we forgot the most important thing. He said, what are you talking about? We did prayer and Torah study and religiosity. And he says, what about midot? What about midot? And midot means good deeds, good attributes, good characteristic traits. He goes, how can we spend a whole year studying Torah and praying, but not make one of our aspirations, right, becoming better people? He says, when we come back from studying in yeshiva for the year, he says, people around us aren't going to know how much we studied. They're not going to know how many prayers we said. What they're going to be able to see is, are we better people now than we were when we went to study in yeshiva? And so he says, you're absolutely right. And he added it to the top of the list, that has to be the focus, that, as we become more religious people, as we become more engrossed in Torah and in worship, at the end of the day, that has to lead us to growing in our midot. That has to reflect the fact that we are becoming better people, right? And that we are developing better characteristic traits. And it's such a beautiful story, because it really gets to kind of the, that neshama, that soul, right? That has that sensibility to say, at the end of the day, that's what we all have to be working on constantly, is becoming better people, becoming more refined, becoming kinder. That has to be at the very essence of who we are and everything ultimately that we do. So really, as a start to kind of this whole focus on Gemilut Chasadim, I think that is the kind of the principle number one, is that it has to be at the core of everything, right? He lists it as the third of the three pillars, but perhaps it's, in a sense, the most central pillar, as it were, because it really is the point, right? It ultimately becomes the very essence of the entire enterprise, right? And that's something that, just to mention again, the Rabbi Sachs obviously really appreciated. That was the core. That's what made Judaism so special, was it the notion of morality, right? That was his final book, was by that title. And if the focus of Judaism is rituals and Torah study, but morality is not there, the whole thing just falls apart. I mean, that's the point. That's the whole point. So that has to always be, in a sense, in front of the person. We have to always be ready to act on it. It has to be the core. It has to be the focus of what we do. And as we saw, most of the things that we do in our life all tie back to that core idea, that notion of doing chesed and midot. That really is the most profound, the most overarching principle in the Jewish tradition. We'll see that in some further sources as well. And so we're going to take a look at a little bit about where this idea comes from in the Torah, this notion of kindness, right? Because you think of some, shall we say, religious communities, right? I mean, in world religion, and you think of, right, those who perhaps live in solitude, right? You think of, religious orders that call for silence and so forth, right? That really focus on a person's religious growth as really being something between them and God, right? And that a person can be deeply religious in isolation from the world around them. But that's really, shall we say, foreign to the Jewish tradition, where to the Jewish tradition, the more religious you are should mean the more refined you are and the more you interact and contribute to those around you, right? It is one of the very pillars of what it means to be a Jew. And so if you have a Jew who, as we mentioned, you can't do it without any of these pillars, right? We need all three. But you can imagine, right, a person who studies Torah all day, worships all day, but doesn't do chesed, what value is there in that, right? Meaning that they're missing the whole point, right? It's about how all of these things ultimately fit together that make them, that make it so special. And so where did these principles come from, right? Where is the Jewish ethos of living a life of chesed? Where does it originate? And so the Talmud addresses it in a number of different ways. And we'll see it kind of addresses it in different directions, as we'll see. So the first source that I want to look at with you for perspective is the source in front of you from the Tractate of Shabbat, page 133b. And here's a teaching of Abba Shaul. So Abba Shaul says, he quotes the verse of Zeh Keli V'Anvehu, right? This is my Lord, and I will glorify him, right? That's what the verse says, right? This is my God, and I will glorify him, right? It's a verse in the Torah. So he says, V'Anvehu should be interpreted as if it were written in two words. Ani V'Hu, not V'Anvehu, which means that I shall glorify him, but this is my God, Ani V'Hu, me and him. What does that mean? Me and him, right? Me and God. So he says, what the Torah is telling us is be similar to God, as it were to him, the Almighty, that we should be as similar to God as possible. We should be dome. We should be similar to God. Just as he is compassionate and merciful, so too should you be compassionate and merciful. And this is a guiding principle in Judaism, right? That all those attributes that we ascribe to God, and we have 13 of them, right? Hashem, Kel Rachum, V'Chanun, Erech Apayim, V'Rav Chesed, V'Emet, right? And so forth, right? We recite them in our prayers on the holidays, right? That this notion is telling us that if that's what God is, then that's what we're supposed to be also, right? That if there is a quality that we ascribe to God, then what that's telling us is that's how we are supposed to be as well, right? We are meant to be as godly as possible. And so we try to adopt the characteristics that we identify with God, right? And so this becomes incredibly important, right? That if we say that God is merciful, if we say that God is compassionate, then that means that as a Jewish person, right, that is what we should be trying to be, right? We should be trying to be as godly as possible. The way we are as godly as possible is to be as compassionate as possible, to be as kind as possible, as merciful as possible. In fact, the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah goes a bit further and says, if you want God to be forgiving to you, then you better be forgiving to other people as well, right? So almost it goes in both directions, right? Meaning this idea that, if we want God to be compassionate, then we need to show God that we're going to be compassionate as well. And then God says, fine. So in a sense, we learn from God how we should act, but ultimately we have the key to ensuring that God will act that way as well. That's how the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah takes it. But on a core idea, the reason there's such a focus in Judaism on kindness to others is because we consider God to be kind, and the whole purpose of Judaism is to be as godly as possible, to live as godly lives as we can, right? And so we study the Torah in order to know what are the ways of God. We pray to God in order to connect, but ultimately the point is to live like God, right? And the way we do that is by following in those attributes that we associate with him. So that's a very important idea. And so that kind of takes that we mimic what God does for how we act as well. So that's one way that we kind of come to the conclusion about how it is that we should conduct ourselves, by essentially looking at the way that we believe God conducts himself. But of course, there's a second component to this as well. And so this is from the famous verse, right, from Vayikra, from Leviticus, of Yahavta l'reacha kamocha, right, that you shall love your fellow as yourself, right, which of course is this idea of how do you know how you should treat other people? Very simply, think how you would want someone to treat you. And if that's how you would want someone to treat you, then you know that that's exactly how you should be treating another person. And in fact, this idea, right, this verse has been made famous by another religion as well. But of course, the origins is in the Torah. And the Talmud in Shabbat, once again, has a beautiful, beautiful story associated with it. And I would expect that most of you have heard it before. But I'll read it. It says, there was another incident involving one Gentile who came before Shammai and said to Shammai, convert me on condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot. So he said to him, he goes, I'll convert, but you have to teach it all to me while on one foot. So Shammai pushed him away with the builder's cubit in his hand. And this is just the added commentary. This was a common measuring stick, and Shammai was a builder by trade, right? So essentially, he said, get out of here. I've been saying Torah my whole life. You want me to teach it to you on one foot? Stop making a joke. And he told him to get lost. It says the same Gentile came before Hillel. He converted him and said to him, right? So he came to him and he said the same thing. Teach me Torah while standing on foot. And it says that Hillel did it. He converted him. Because he said to him, he says, that which is hateful to you, do not do to another. That is the entire Torah. The rest is interpretation. Go study. And this is just the most magnificent teaching, where he says that the core idea in the entire Torah, right, is be kind to other people. Treat other people well. That is the very essence of the entire enterprise. The rest of it, the rest of the Torah is simply, in a sense, an interpretation, or shall we say, a manifestation of that core principle. But it's from that principle that everything else emanates. And so once again, you have this idea, right, of how central chesed, how central kindness is to Judaism and to the way that we live our lives. And if a person, sometimes you wonder, when it comes to, laws of Shabbat and Kashrut, you say, what are the laws? You got to go open books. You have to study. You got to look into it. It's not necessarily so easy all the time. When it comes to, how do I treat another person? It's very simple. How do you want to be treated? Go do that. Then go do that. And I think that that's something which is just so simple. And it's something that makes it so beautiful, that if you know how you feel when you're having a hard day and you'd like someone to speak to you. So treat them that way. You know how you would want a boss to treat you. So make sure you treat the people who work for you in that kind of way, right? The way that you, want your family members to speak to you. Make sure you speak to your family members that way as well. Meaning it's oftentimes we're very good at knowing what we want. We're not necessarily good at thinking what other people want, but it's the same thing. It ultimately is the same thing. And I think that's such an important idea of really just being thoughtful to other people's needs and how other people might be feeling, in a sense, put yourself in their shoes, and what would you want in that instance? That tells you, what you would want as well. And, it means kind of like going a little out of your way, making a point, to help other people if you see someone who's having a hard time, another one of his rabbis from yeshiva was saying about my nephew that I guess another boy had come to the yeshiva from a place where he didn't know any of the other kids in the school. He came from a town where he was the only kid who went to yeshiva, and he was feeling lonely and he was feeling kind of sad. And he said that it was Donny who went over and, every night would go to the dorm room and they would have a chat and just be his friend, and make him realize that he wasn't there by himself. And, it's so easy. It's so easy to be kind to another person. You just think about how would you feel? And that's exactly what you do for somebody else. And again, there's so many manifestations to chesed. We have so many mitzvot that relate to it. But at its very core, it's saying, you want to be close to God? So act like God. Be kind, be compassionate, be generous, right? You want to know how to treat someone? Just think how you'd like to be treated. It's not, at the end of the day, humans can be very complicated. We can also be very simple. These are very simple calculations ultimately to make. Okay, let's move on to some additional and kind of ultimately final points as well, because I think obviously, as I mentioned, chesed, kindness to others, gemilut chasadim, has so many different manifestations. I mean, it has to do from burying the dead to helping people with their wedding plans, to visiting the sick. I mean, like you talk about from happy occasions to sad occasions, chesed applies to them all, right? Meaning you can do chesed, in all situations. It's not a thing that only applies in difficult or easy times. It applies at all times. And so I want to, therefore, take a little bit of a look about this notion, about perhaps one way that we can show chesed that I think is so simple and yet is perhaps so relevant, because some of these acts of kindness, of course, reflect different circumstances. Like you got to wait for a wedding to go do that. You got to wait for someone to be ill to do that. But there's some chesed that, of course, applies all the time. And that's the one that I want to take a look at with you in the next source. So here we have in this source a beautiful teaching. I want to focus on the middle part of it to start with. So here it says, Rabbi Matya ben Charash Omer. So Rabbi Matya ben Charash said, upon meeting people, be the first to extend greetings. Havi makdim bishlom kol adam. Which usually is translated as it is here. Upon meeting someone, be the first to extend a greeting. And it's something which is so simple, right? The point is that go over, say hello to someone, shalom aleichem, right? You greet someone, you engage with someone, you don't wait for them to come to you. I can't tell you how many people I've met in synagogue who've like gone to synagogue with the same person for years and they've never spoken to each other. And it's unbelievable. People aren't practicing this principle. I mean, this isn't Pirke Abot, this is an ancient teaching. You go over and you say hello to somebody. It's the easiest thing to do. If you feel bad, you've been in synagogue, you don't know the person's name, come ask the rabbi, they'll tell you what the person's name is. Don't worry about that. The idea that, you see someone, you should go over and say hello, and don't take they should say hello to me. No, go say hello to somebody. It's the easiest thing in the world to do. And the person that you say to, it's wonderful. I mean, that's how you build community. That's how you care, about one another. And it's something which is so simple, to do. And, I sometimes, it's interesting that the statement starts with a very difficult teaching by Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai said, I'll just read it here. He says, it's not in our hands to explain the reason, either of the security of the wicked or even the affliction of the righteous. Right? So he starts with the difficult idea that it's very hard for us to understand justice in this world. And obviously the death of my nephew, it's an unanswerable question. But I think, there's this idea of like, we can't often answer the difficult questions, but we can always be kind to each other. We can always be kind to each other. You see someone that's suffering, you hear sometimes people that I don't know what to say, I don't want to say the wrong thing. So they say nothing. Don't say nothing. Go over and say, hello, how are you? It's very simple. You give them a smile, and I think that's ultimately, we can't answer the difficult questions, but we can always see how somebody's doing. You can always inquire. And that idea of say it first means like you do it because it's what you want to do. You're not doing it to get a response. And it's true, sometimes when someone has had a loss, they're not going to respond. That doesn't mean that they don't appreciate the fact that you've reached out. People have sent me letters after my nephew's passing. I haven't been able to respond to everybody yet, but I appreciate every single letter that I've received. And in time, I'll respond to all of them. Sometimes when you have a loss, it's difficult to find the words. It's difficult to engage. But every person that says, I'm sorry, how are you? It's always appreciated. It's always that kind word. And I love the final teaching in this, because he's trying to think what the connections are. It says, be a tail unto lions and not a head unto foxes. And in the Jewish tradition, the lion is the regal, is the dignified, and the fox is the one who's always playing games. And it's it's better to be the tail of the dignified than to be the head of the of those who act in inappropriate ways. Those who are shifty. At the end of the day, we want to be associated with goodness, with kindness. That is our goal, and that's where a person should firmly plant themselves, in terms of people that you associate with, the life that you lead, the communities, your business, colleagues. You want to be with people who are these kinds of people who are just good, just kind, that are thoughtful to one another. And something I loved about my nephew was he was just a sweet kid. You saw from those pictures, those beautiful smiles, that he had, just a real chen to him, a real kindness to him. And I remember, so the last time that I saw him was in Yerushalayim a year and a half ago. He had gone to Israel to visit yeshivot in preparation for going to study, to decide where he was going to spend the year. So I went and I spent Shabbat with my brother and my nephew. They spent the whole week there. I went to spend just the weekend with them. And I remember my nephew, I'd be like, oh, should we go do this? Okay. What about that? Okay. He was so easygoing, he was just happy to kind of go along with whatever I wanted to do. And was just a really nice, sweet kid. And, I think of that's something that we should all be aspiring to, is just being kind, having a smile, seeing how somebody else is doing, this phrase in here of, makdim bishlom kol adam, may mean say hello to someone first. It may mean like you should always inquire first about how somebody is doing. Makdim bishlom, check out the shlom, check out the welfare of every person, meaning be inquisitive, care about other people, don't, take the initiative, not in a overbearing kind of way, but in a kind way, is always something which is welcomed. And the point is to just be a good person, and then ultimately that is the very essence of what it means to be a good Jew, and to be a real Torah Jew, right? To be, shall we say, an Orthodox Jew, right? A person who, is observant of the mitzvot, without being a good person is impossible. If you're not a good person, you're not an Orthodox Jew, right? Because that's so much of what it means to be an observant Jew. And perhaps sometimes people get distracted by all the rules and regulations, and almost sometimes maybe miss the point. I mean, it's a very sad thing to say, miss the point that the very essence ultimately is how we treat one another. That is the most important thing. To be upright and upstanding and kind and generous is the very essence, is the whole purpose of the Torah. And I think no statement says that better than the final source I'm going to share with you. And I love this. It's a difficult source, but it's beautiful. And so this is in the Talmud as well, in the tractate of Yoma, which deals with the laws of Yom Kippurim. And it says, Abaye said, as it was taught in a Braita, that it is stated, and you shall love the Lord your God, right? We know that verse, V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. You shall love the Lord your God, which means that you shall make the name of heaven beloved. How do you love God? By making God beloved, right? That's how, right? The Torah can't command you in emotions. Emotions are hard, but it can command you in actions. So the Talmud says, what does it mean that you shall love God? You shall cause God to be beloved. So how should one do so? One should do so in that he should read Torah and learn Mishnah and serve Torah scholars, and he should be pleasant with people in his business transactions. What do people say about such a person? Fortunate is his father who taught him Torah. Fortunate is his teacher who taught him Torah. Woe to the people that have not studied Torah. So-and-so who taught him Torah, see how pleasant are his ways, how proper are his deeds. The verse states about him and others like him, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. So when you see someone who's a Torah scholar, who's also of refined character, that causes God to be beloved. Because then people say, wow, look at the Torah, right? Look at what the Torah brings to another person, right? Look at the qualities of a person who's a Torah scholar, right? That is how one causes people to love God. But it continues, one who reads Torah and learns Mishnah and serves Torah scholars, but his business practices are not done faithfully, and he does not speak pleasantly with other people, what do people say about him? Woe to so-and-so who studied Torah. Woe to his father who taught him Torah. Woe to his teacher who taught him Torah. So-and-so who studied Torah, see how destructive are his deeds and how ugly are his ways. About him and others like him, the verse states that the Gentiles will say, men said of them, these are the people of the Lord, yet they had to leave his land, right? That we were exiled for our misdeeds. Through their sins and subsequent exile, such people have desecrated the name of God, right? And so this is such an important source because it ultimately says that the way one acts ultimately is reflective or is reflected back on one's study of Torah. And so if a person studies Torah and is a good person, then people will say, wow, look at those Jews. You know, they've got something special. Look how wonderful they are. You know, but if someone sees a knowledgeable Jew who acts, you know, inappropriately and is immoral, is unkind, then people think of that Torah, you know, all that halacha, you know, look, it just ruins people. You know, they're bad people, and that obviously is a desecration of God's name. And so there is, you know, ultimately this responsibility for those who study Torah to live according to the Torah, and ultimately through that to inspire other people to appreciate the beauty of our Jewish tradition. And that oftentimes the Torah will not be judged on what it says. The Torah is judged by what those who study it do, right? And if those who study it live in a beautiful way, then that is ultimately how people will judge the Torah. And I find this to be perhaps one of the most powerful teachings about this subject. And I love this line in there where they say, you know, about fortunate is his father who taught him Torah, or woe is his father who taught him Torah. And, you know, I just think about my nephew, and, you know, I kind of go back to that. You know, he became such a wonderful young man, and such wonderful qualities, and, you know, all three pillars of Judaism. And I just think, you know, how fortunate was his father who taught him Torah. You know, how fortunate was his mother who taught him Torah. You know, what a beautiful ultimate tribute to them was the life that Donny led. You know, that you know, he ultimately reflected the best of the Torah. You know, the best of what it means to be an observant Jew. You know, somebody who was, you know, committed to his study of the tradition, a person who was religiously devout in his prayer, you know, and was someone who was just kind and easygoing and smiled and was just pleasant, you know, and thoughtful, you know, to those around them. And, you know, when you have all of those things together, then all you can say is, wow, what a beautiful tradition. What a beautiful community, what a beautiful Torah. You know, I want to be a part of that, you know, as well. And, you know, you'll meet people who are Balei Teshuvah, you know, or people who leave Judaism. And it's almost always based on the people that they know. You know, if someone meets some wonderful observant Jewish people, they say, well, I want to be part of that. You know, someone grows up and knows some terrible observant Jews. That's when they say, forget it, I'm out of here. I don't want anything to do with that. And you really appreciate kind of the responsibility, you know, that we have, that, you know, to not live a half Judaism, not live a two-pillar Judaism. That for Judaism to work, it's all three of the pillars. It's all three of them. That's ultimately how it's done. And my nephew lived that way. He was doing all three pillars. It makes his loss all the more heartbreaking. But he left a really beautiful legacy, I think, for all of us to learn from and to try our best to incorporate and to kind of live up to. He only lived 19 years. He lived a short life, but he taught us all a lesson, and for that I'm incredibly grateful. And so may Tehei Nishmato Tzur B'Tzur HaChaim, may his memory, may his soul be bound up in the soul of everlasting life, and may his memory and the life that he led always inspire all of us. I know that I will always remember my nephew and keep him close to my heart, and just on a personal note, and just to say to thank you to all of you for coming to these classes. I know you've come to learn, but it's meant a lot to me to be able to have this opportunity to reflect and to share. So I thank you for coming and being a part of that. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, Eddie, please.
I haven't a question, but first of all.
Sorry.
Yes, that's okay.
I've been having quite a deep philosophical thought when it comes to Yom Kippur, and we recite a whole catalogue of Oshamnu, Bagadnus, and Al-Chetz, and particularly the Ashkenazim. The Al-Chetz seem to run to dozens. They're almost all of them, they relate to how we've behaved to our fellow man, or how we misbehaved. But I don't think there is an Al-Chet that says we have failed to study Torah. And thinking about it, maybe the answer is that is literally unforgivable. If we fail to study Torah, then you can't be forgiven.
God is compassionate and kind. Everything can be forgiven, but certainly it's a fundamental, right? Because if you don't study, then you can't know. But worthwhile to ponder. Thank you, Eddie.
Rabbi, I just want to say thank you for these talks. I will never forget, particularly the notebook that you showed us last week of your nephew. That has changed how I organize my life. And for that, I am grateful. And I cannot imagine the heartache it must be for you to remember him and think of him. And you're very brave, and thank you very much.
Yes, I'd like to also reiterate that. I think it's so moving and just unbelievable, Rabbi Shalom, the way you've given these lectures. They're fantastic. I mean, we've learned a lot. There may be sources that many of us do, but you brought them to life, and you brought them into our lives through your Donny, Zichron Livracha. I'd like to ask a question. I do thank you for that. I'm very moved by it. I really can't say too much. It's an unbelievable loss. I don't know. But my question to you, Rabbi, is I wonder how we can square the Rambam's notion that we only teach Torah to people who are good. And I understand that you explained it very clearly, and the Rambam explains it very clearly. But immediately when you gave us that source, I thought of the Hillel and Shammai incident, which you brought in later on. Because I said, look, Hillel, maybe this person had good midot, but Hillel, I don't think he knew. It was before Shabbat, and he was coming, and he could have been really somebody who was a very trying person, and, trying to take the mick, as we would say today. It's a horrible word, and yet look at the way Hillel treated him and how beautifully, and you illustrated that. So I don't understand how we can square that with the Rambam. The Rambam is brilliant. I'm not trying to to criticize him, but when you read it, I've heard it before. I found that quite strange. I think you should be able to take anybody, because Hillel showed such patience when he showed people you can't be a Kohen Gadol and you can't be this and you can't be that. They're asking stupid questions, well, it's not stupid, sorry, you have to be where they are, but questions that really you could say, people without good midot, how can you want to aspire to be a Kohen Gadol? how do we square that with Rambam, you know, saying only teach it to a good person? I'm a teacher myself. I teach anybody who comes and asks me. I'm not a rabbi. I'm only an ordinary teacher. But I should imagine, Rabbi Shalom, you would teach anybody who came to want to learn. You wouldn't worry about their midot. I'm asking you. It troubles me.
Yeah. Listen, that's what I'm saying. It's a quite striking teaching from Rambam. He obviously felt, there's one thing to kind of just teach something. The Beit Midrash means like you're really like engaging with these sacred texts. And I think he felt that, to engage in that way was, you need to be of a refined character. Otherwise, ultimately, we saw the last source. If someone is knowledgeable in Torah and then acts in an unrefined way, it only brings,
Right.
it ultimately does not reflect the Torah. And I think Rambam was perhaps sensitive to that. So yes, we teach anyone, we teach, but there's a difference between like someone becoming a scholar who's does not have midot, which I think is what the Beit Midrash represents, kind of deep, engrossed study, and teaching them. Yes, teach them the core on one foot. Tell them. I think that's the answer, Flora. What's the core principle? Love your neighbor as yourself. That's what Hillel said. The rest of the commentary. Yes. So he's telling him that's where it all starts. I mean, ultimately, maybe that's exactly what Rambam is saying. That's where it begins. If you can't get past that, the rest of it doesn't even apply to you.
But nevertheless, it still begs the question that you could make a person to a good person, or motivate them. They could be a rasha to begin with.
No, so Rambam
look at Resh Lakish. Look at Resh Lakish.
So Flora, that's what Rambam says. Rambam says first help them improve their midot.
Okay.
And bring them to the Beit Midrash. Okay. It doesn't say leave them. It doesn't say get rid of them. Yeah. He just says there's a process.
Don't take them. Yeah. Just when you read it, it sounds very black and white. But you're right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you very much again. They've been just. Your Donny, may his soul rest in peace, and he'll be alive. He'll always be alive to everybody. I think we feel he's with us.
Thank you, Flora.
Hi, Rabbi.
Oh, hi, Renee.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, good. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you all. Does any?
I just want to wish you personally, Chaim Arukim. I registered for your whole course, and I only made this evening, I'm sorry, and I wondered if you had any recordings that
all of them have been recorded and are on YouTube.
Thank you.
So I can more than happy to share them with everyone.
Just send us the link, please.
Yes.
I'd be grateful.
Yes.
Thank you. And his smile really lit the world. He looked a beautiful, and I watched the whole Levaya, the whole thing, and I saw you right in front. It was heartbreaking. Yeah. I don't know how you lived through that.
Yeah.
Anyway, my best wishes.
Everyone's love and support is how you live through things like that. That's the answer.
Okay. Take care. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we look forward to the next session.
So perhaps let's move on to that. So first of all, thank you all for coming to this series. Moving on to the next thing. I know it's going to start this coming week or the week after. I'm planning to do a series on Sephardim and Yerushalayim. And it'll be a 3-part series. One will be looking at the Sephardim in Sfarad, in Spain, and Yerushalayim. One will be looking at the relationship kind of in the kind of post expulsion Sephardim and Yerushalayim. And then one will look at kind of into early modern times with Sephardim and Yerushalayim, which
sounds very interesting.
An angle connection with the Spanish and Portuguese and so forth. So hopefully that will be of interest to everyone as this time of year where obviously we remember Yerushalayim and the Chorban. So it's always good to spend some time thinking about the time of year that we're in, and hopefully feel a bit more connected to it through the beautiful. There's many different connections between the Sephardim and Yerushalayim, so I'll save it for the class. But there's a lot to sink your teeth into and to connect with. So thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Keep an eye out for that. And
Yes.
hope to see you all soon. Smachot, happy occasions, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. That was excellent.
Have a wonderful holiday. Have a wonderful rest.
Yeah.
All the best, everyone.